A few moments later. A few minutes later. A few inches later. 12 seconds later. 3 days later. 3 weeks later. Many months later. 6.5 hours later. 1 eternity later. 2,000 years later. 3:28 a.m. Tomorrow. Day 2, day 3, day 4.
25 seconds later.
346 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. 20 minutes later. 2 seconds later. 10 seconds later.
5,000 celebrities later.
6 months later.
8 semesters later. You get the idea. Late again. 1 weekend of pampering later. 1 hour later. The next day. 1 shift later. Many minutes later. 6 months later. 1 pathetic sob story later. 1 nap later. 1 season later. 3 hours later. A little later. 82 kilometers later. Many unbearable hours later. 3,000 whoop-whoos later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. Soon after, 5 minutes later. Graduation day. 1 semester later. More moments later. Moments later. 4 to 6 days later. Later. The next day. 1 hour later. The very next evening. End of flashback. Flashback. The next morning. Many tic-tacs later. 2 hours later. 48 hours later. 8 hours later. The following Thursday. 5 minutes later. 24 hours later. Much later. Much later. 7 hours later. A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 2 hours later. 3 days later. 15 minutes later. Several months later. Thousands of tears later. 2 hours later. Much later. Yesterday. Many hours later. 75 years later. 2 hours later. 1 extremely annoying shift later. 2 very boring minutes later. 3 hours later. The following day. Meanwhile, just then. Later. 1 hour later. 5 hours later. 2 days later. Approximately 10 hours later. Early the next morning. 1 shift later. 2 weeks later. 11 minutes later. 5 minutes later. A lot of boring math later. 24 hours later. 1 week later. 1 long angry line later. 72 hours later. 2 hours later. Just then. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. 6 months later. Tomorrow for sure. Meanwhile, eventually, 12 o'clock midnight. 2 hours later. Several days later. Later that same evening. 8:01 p.m. 3 days later. 3 weeks later. 7:59 a.m. 3 days later. 1 week later. 3,000 years later. Much later. 346 minutes later. 10 seconds later. The next day. 3 hours later. 8 hours later. 1 minute 37 seconds later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 2 hours later.